Well, good morning to you all online. A warm welcome from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy. I'm Roger Crofts. I have the good fortune of convening a specialist group called Community of Interest on the Environment. And that's very appropriate to this fifth and final talk and discussion in our series. We call it Contested Rural Environments, because I'm sure many of you know there are lots of issues and debates, and what we are trying to do in this series is to stimulate informed debate around the country, provoked by specially selected speakers from around the country, and we certainly have two today in Ailsa and Frank. The topic today is regional identity and heritage. And that's a very important subject to many people, not just living in rural areas or moving to them, but also people who visit them and who maybe, like myself, live in urban areas. And that's the whole essence of Scotland's National Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, is to stimulate informed debate, not just to talk at people, but to actually use that word stimulate so that we have an interaction. And this is one of a series that we have been doing. We've already covered land use and restoring nature, energy futures, tourism, housing and population retention, and health and social care. So to kick us off today, we have two expert speakers, and it's a great pleasure to introduce them. Ailsa Raeburn is Chair of Community Land Scotland, and she's had a great deal of involvement in community land issues for a long period of time. Started life as a chartered surveyor in Argyll, looking at property development, management and regeneration. She is chair of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust, which many of you will know is one of the forerunners of the community land ownership movement in Scotland, and she's always been involved in the past in the Isle of Gear Heritage Trust. Community Land Scotland is trying to encourage not just rural communities but urban communities as well to acquire and develop locally important land and buildings. And obviously, given the political agendas here in Scotland through the government and the Scottish Parliament to influence policy and legislation. And interestingly enough, there are some really important issues coming up with a land reform bill, a community wealth building bill, and a promise before the end of this parliamentary session, a human rights bill. So there's a real role for Ailsa and her team at Community Land Scotland. She's also a member of the board of Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Crown Estate Scotland. So first I'm going to invite Ailsa to give her 5 minutes worth from her perspective. Ailsa, over to you.
Thanks very much, Roger, and thank you to the Royal Society for the invitation to speak today in this important and timely series of debates looking at Scotland. Together with Frank, I've been asked to think about regional identity and heritage and the debate around rural Scotland's identity. What are its unique characteristics and values? Which aspects should be prioritised, and where decision-making about that prioritisation should lie? Who should benefit from rural Scotland's world-beating renewables and natural capital opportunities? To whom do the benefits of the marketisation of our cultural heritage belong? And how do we ensure we hear all of the voices of rural Scotland? Well, that debate's been a long and well-contested one. And it's a debate that's been largely shaped and promoted by those out with rural Scotland, many groups with conflicting identities and ideas of what rural Scotland is and should be, whether that be the landlords, the Westminster and latterly Holyrood policymakers, the international sportsmen, the wealthy looking for the landscape scale representation of their egos. I've borrowed that great phrase from Fraser MacDonald. The renewables developers, the global environmental philanthropists aghast at the inability of rural Scots to manage their own backyards. The tourism entrepreneurs searching for the next new experience for the well-heeled traveller, using our rural identity as their marketable asset. and the financial speculators, always hungry for the pretty impressive returns that can be made in one of the last great unregulated land markets in the world. So there are a lot of identities for such a relatively small space. It's no wonder sometimes that the less powerful and influential and wealthy voices really struggle to be heard. So those individuals and communities that want to build local businesses to provide services for local people, but can't get land or premises to operate from, or can't get housing for their staff, or struggle to keep their staff because the local pub and schools closed because so many local homes have gone to second home use or short-term lets and are dark in the winter, or they can't rely on the rest and be thankful being open or the ferries running. So regional rural identities in Scotland have often been rooted in concepts of colonialism based on the Highlands and Lowland clearances, where patterns of ownership and control have been externally imposed and managed, with wealth from rural Scotland's natural assets having been extracted rather than reinvested over centuries. And whilst there are strong cultural differences between the Highlands and Lowlands, these external influences in ownership, control, and identity have impacted equally. Both have led to an increase in the concentration and scale of land ownership, often by absentee owners with no connection to the land or the communities that live on that land, and control over decisions of the people that live on that land without recourse to conversations with the people that live on that land. Many of the large and powerful and influential landowners of previous eras, the Sutherlands and the Argylls and the Buccleuchs, are gradually being replaced by new green lairds. So Wildland, now the largest owner of land in Scotland, is owned by an absentee Danish billionaire, and Gresham House, the third largest, owned by American corporate interests. At least the earlier system of landlords had some cultural or family connection and acceptance of regional identity in their local ownerships and an understanding of that, but this is being lost. Allied to this today, we're seeing the advent of the second power revolution in rural Scotland, with the development of the onshore and offshore wind farms, huge pumped hydro schemes, and other industrialised installations, which are changing the landscape, bringing in really good, well-paid jobs, but also impacting on local services and housing availability. And at the same time, the environment in rural Scotland has suffered hugely from environmental degradation, with Scotland now being 28th from the bottom out of 240 countries or territories in terms of its loss of biodiversity, with 1 in 9 species at risk of extinction. Much of this, of course, is linked to those monolithic patterns of land ownership and use, the focus on environmentally damaging land uses such as sheep grazing, deer and industrial planting, all of which has been enabled and facilitated by ongoing public subsidy and policy. And of course, none of this real identity of our Scotland and rural areas chimes well with the wild and empty landscapes identity of the Visit Scotland brochures. Meanwhile, our cultural heritage is at risk, largely through the drain of people exacerbated by population decline and the loss of services and facilities. I know Frank is going to talk more about our rich rural heritage of vibrant local traditions and close-knit communities, but with the population in some areas forecast to fall by 20% by 2043, this cultural heritage is extremely precarious. So to conclude, what's rural Scotland for? What's its unique selling point that will protect its cultural heritage, environment and communities over the next decades? Is it the focus on the renewables revolution, bringing good jobs and new people? Is it about making the most effective and equitable use of Scotland's natural resources to address the biodiversity and climate crises through a just transition? Or is it about protecting local culture, local community cohesiveness and building rather than extracting local wealth? And in all of these discussions, we must be looking forwards and not backwards, and we must be listening to our young people to better understand their perceptions of rural Scotland's identity and its value, and what will encourage and persuade them to stay and build. So to conclude, I think I know one of the answers to this and where these cross-cutting themes could merge, and I say it's in the power of the local. We know there's a proven, well-established, well-evidenced, fair and equitable policy mechanism that helps deliver locally owned economic benefit and uses local skills and knowledge to protect the environment and build resilience against climate change. It allows local culture and heritage to thrive and it listens to young people and how they think their areas should be developed for future generations. It's called Community Ownership, and I hope we get the chance to discuss it today, Roger. Thanks very much.
Excellent. What a wonderful start. You've set out everything in all of the conflicts and the dichotomies. I'm now going to introduce, excuse me, Frank Rennie. But before I do that, I should have said at the outset that after our debate, I'm going to invite Des Thompson to summarise the main points from the debate, and then ask our two speakers to give us their final thought each before I wrap it up, and thank you all very much. So firstly, to introduce the summariser, and then I'll introduce Frank. Des Thompson, long-standing expert on biodiversity in Scotland, from when he was a wee boy out in the hills, counting birds and birds' nests with his parents, who wrote many famous textbooks. And he's gone on and carrying on the family lineage in that, writing copiously on many different subjects relating to our nature, and getting more recently into an advisory and advocacy role, working latterly in Scottish Natural Heritage and then Nature Scot, and now he's, I think we could call him an independent consultant, but he is a Leverhulme Fellow, also involved in the University of the Highlands and Islands, but also involved in the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species. And that's what he does in the mornings, and then he does more and more of that in the afternoons and the evenings, most days of the week. Frank Rennie is a bit the same, actually. I think there's a wonderful Scottish word, ken speckled, and that's definitely Frank. He has been and developed a wonderful expertise in that portmanteau word, sustainable development, but he understands it more than most people, because he doesn't just look at it from a social or an economic or an environmental. He's got his feet firmly on the ground in the Long Island, where he works with local communities, he teaches and has taught through what is now University of the Highlands and Islands, based at Newcastle College in Stornoway, and also he's another who sits and writes, and you can see behind him, he's probably written a good few of those books in his bookshelves behind him anyway. So, Frank, it's a pleasure to introduce you and ask what your thoughts are alongside what Ailsa's already set up for this wonderful dialogue and debate.
Okay, thanks, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've been sitting in on all the sessions so far, so it's they've been really entertaining and thought-provoking, so let's hope we can continue in that trend. I think I would begin by echoing some of the points that Ailsa has made, because I think that sense of place is a really fundamental condition in humans and human society. We all know places that we like, places that we prefer, places we're uncomfortable with, places we'd rather stay in, places we do stay in of choice, but we then migrate and visit other areas for recreation and so on and so forth. So is that sense of place is a really fundamental part. And what I've noticed, however, is that the more societies become globalized, watching the same TV programs and the same movies and so on and so forth, the more local communities actually bounce back to emphasize and enhance the particularly unique aspects that they have, whether it's local cuisine, whether it's going to be traditional music or arts and crafts, whether it's in fact just the environment itself, going away to a place like the Cairngorms or something like that has a very distinctive feel to it. These are fundamental to our understanding of rural places and community places. However, there are many threats as well as challenges that sneak up on us with these things there, and the danger is twofold, I think. One is we pay a lip service to that, and it becomes a parody of itself. It becomes a little caricature, a sort of whiskey galore caricature of itself, and that then becomes feel like living in a museum. It becomes fossilized. It becomes stagnant, and then going through there, and that's certainly not the intention. The other thing is that the attraction of these places, bringing new blood and bringing new people to live in here, then there's a balance there between people coming in and learning about the place and understanding about the place, or bringing in the things they've left behind them. So, for example, social media, you just a quick look at that technological cesspool you'll see is full of stories about people who've moved to the countryside and then complain about getting woken up in the morning by the cows and all this sort of stuff there, and you wonder what on earth they thought about before they went there. So it's about how we can actually enhance these sense of uniqueness of place, of local identity, without making it somehow diluted or mangled in the whole process. I think it's also a key between balancing the idea of the changing demography of places with the fact that you're trying to encourage this healthy entrepreneurial mix within a place, and capitalizing really, or maybe even commercializing some of the aspects of that uniqueness without commodifying it, without turning it into some sort of thing that you want to sell as it just happens to be. And this is there's a contradiction in this, that we talk about investment in things like motorways, but we talk about subsidizing farmers, for example, and the choice of language we use can be quite pejorative. And I've lost count the number of times I've been called a remote place, and I've lost count of the number of times I've seen Visit Scotland. Every time they mention the Outer Hebrides, it's with a picture of an empty beach. And so there is more than that within ideas. And to deal with this, it has to be approached in an interdisciplinary manner. There's too often we've been looking at urban solutions for rural problems. We've looked at things in silos, and these things have had knock-on effects. So we've had new ideas developing, new businesses in rural areas, building on the strength of the characteristic, and at the same time not having houses for people to live in, not having the transport to get from A to B as it goes through. So these things are not black and white. They're not simple. We can perhaps explore some of these in the following questions and comments. But I think it's I'd like to finish with a quote from Gandhi. And Gandhi said, "Although I open my window to the winds of all the worlds, I will not let it blow me off my feet." So we have to know about our sense of place and our sense of belonging to a place to actually understand how we can move onto that from a position of strength and confidence, rather than just the ability to merely survive in those places. So I'll finish there, Roger, and I'm sure we can pick up some other things on the back of that.
Well, some more excellent points, Frank, from there. So come on the chat, please. Start putting in your questions, your comments to get this moving on. We've got one from Jane, who asks about what do our speakers think of how the modern forces like tourism impact on the authenticity of rural Scottish heritage. Ailsa, do you want to have a shot at that first?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because communities that I'm involved with think about this all the time. So if I can talk with specific experience about egg, tourism is a mainstay of the economy. We need tourists. We want people to come. We want to share what egg is all about, but they need to come on egg terms. So they can't bring their car, and the accommodation is limited. We don't expect them to come and find a cinema, etc., etc. So I think in Scotland we need to accept that people are coming with different experiences and different expectations, and it's very hard. We need to accept it's very hard to be all things to all people, and and we've seen the impacts of over-tourism in some locations, particularly where you don't have a community that has a strong enough voice to resist over-tourism. We've seen issues of short-term lets and second homes, etc. And we need mechanisms to address those to make sure we have the right balance. So I think it's about remaining authentic and true to what the Scottish experience is. I'm obviously not Scottish. I've lived in Scotland for a long time, and I hope I have a reasonably good idea of what that experience is. And it's not probably Harry Potter, and it's not probably doing the Highlands in a day on a coach tour, you know, going from Edinburgh to Inverness to Skye and then back again. So I think it behoves us to think about the experience that we're offering, and how that is authentic and true, and perhaps accepting that, you know, we do need to diversify our economy in some places and not be over reliant on tourism, because we can't be all things to all people.
Oh, thank you, Frank.
Yeah, I think the key to that is working with communities rather than doing things unto communities. Community structures are socially built, socially constructed, and I think we have to be much more aware of interpreting ourselves and shaping these things as we want to be seen, rather than as seen to others. Too often, the decisions taken, the impact upon local communities are taken far removed from the places that actually have to live with the outcomes of these things. So I think it's about, you know, this Balmoralisation of Scotland. This you know, if you walk up the Royal Mile, for example, it's shop after shop with tart and tat. This creation is a long tradition, and it's not necessarily, you know, it's not necessarily even owned or controlled by local people, but it's the way its people are portrayed, and it's that image that has to be actually challenged in terms of how do you do, not to say we always get it right, let's say, from the local perspective. But I mean, one of the big hopes in recent years has been the growth of community land trusts, because community land trusts have actually put the decision-making power in local communities, and not just about land issues and crofting issues or environmental issues, but also other things in culture and history and renewable energy and recycling and you know, children's play groups and a whole range of things there, where people have actually felt the confidence to go in and assert themselves and say, you know, we're not better than you, and we're different from you, and we have different values, and that's why we choose to live here.
Can we just follow on from that? There are some more questions in there. Who makes the decisions then? Because it's been quite interesting, isn't it, about, you know, the North 500, ideas about a Southwest 350, and yet the chaos that comes locally, you know, the fairy pools of Skye up Glen Brittle, etc. Have we got the decision making the wrong way around then? And what should we be doing about it?
I think, Roger, the Fairport is a good example, actually, because there was a huge amount of interest sparked by Instagram, all sorts of people coming, expecting a particular experience. And when they got there, the experience actually wasn't that great. And so the landowners worked with the local community to put in facilities, and the facilities are owned by the community. So the income from those facilities go back to the community. They then reinvest that in employing rangers and providing interpretation, and doing all the things to make the tourism experience better, but also the community experience better. So I think we don't need to be binary about this. We don't need to say it's either tourism or communities, because as Frank's already referenced, there's a Scottish Community Association of Tourism Operators. You know, they're doing really good work. But again, I know organisations like National Trust for Scotland, they're trying to work with local communities to try and find that balance between everybody accepting that tourism is a mainstay of the economy. We do need it, but it just needs to be managed better. And we need to ensure that all of the wealth and the profits from tourism enterprises are not extracted, but they do remain locally in some form. So I think that there are good lessons out there that we can learn from.
I think we've also left. I mean, the Highlands and Islands Development Board, to go back a few decades, was set up specifically to deal with Highlands and Islands issues and Highlands and Islands problems, and that's been watered down successfully over the years by various governments. and putting into place that things have to be a market-led solution. That's a really difficult position when you haven't got a strong community. I mean, most of the interventions in the old HIDB, or many of them certainly, were because of market failure. There weren't enough people to keep the petrol station open. There weren't enough people to keep the local shop open, etc., etc. And therefore, it had to have different solutions to these things. And we've lost sight of that. We've lost sight of that. It's this uniformitarian approach to these things, that one size fits all, and we get really upset because you can't find your cinema on Egg or Gia or whatever else and whatnot. I mean, go somewhere else. You don't come to Scotland to lie on a beach, for goodness sake. I mean, that's common sense, really.
Okay, that absolutely fair. We're back to the age-old argument, aren't we here? And others might want to comment on this, that Scotland isn't a level playing field. There's certainly not rural areas and island areas, and I've only lived and worked here for 56 years. But it's built into me now. But Dillon, Hampshire, comes into a specific here. Do national parks help or hinder? You'll be familiar with the fact we've got the two parks, but then there is now a highly, and I'm using the words carefully, contested debate about a Galloway National Park. I live a lot of the time in that area, and all of a sudden there's division which didn't exist before. So what are your views? Frank, do you want to kick off on this one?
Well, I think there are 2 points I think I would raise on that one. I don't think national parks have actually been managed in the way that they've been envisaged in the first place. There's a whole lot of vested political interests that are kicking the ball around there, and actually the last thing to think about very often is the local community. I think the other thing to think about, though, is there's a whole variety in terms of the how these take place. I think there's an issue of if local communities were able to get more involved in these issues, then some of the tension would actually come out from the first place. It's not to say that these things are that local community is good and outside is bad. That's not the case at all. But the fact that it's so heavily preponderant upon people taking decisions out with the area is a huge part of the problem, I think, when it comes to these things.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo what Frank's saying there in terms about who's making the decisions. I think if there are opportunities to hear those local voices and ensure that ownership of those decisions and ownership of key local assets remains with local people, I think they are useful. Where they're just a marketing tool, they're not useful. That increases house prices and increases prices of hotels, then absolutely no, I don't think we should be looking at further national parks. But they are potentially a good opportunity to bring a whole range of people together to think about how land should be used. So as long as you've got those voices in a forum where everyone's voices are equal, I think potentially they do have some merit and value. But as Frank said, it really depends on how they're organised and whose voices you're hearing the loudest in them.
The other thing I would add to that, Ailsa, is bad landowners die. Bad community, bad corporate businesses go on and on and on. Bad committees just get replaced by different people coming on there. So the idea of actually, of institutions owning these things, owning reserves, owning large areas of land, rather than working with communities to actually achieve those ends, is in the long term, I think, counterintuitive. It's just replacing one form of land management or land ownership with another that is even less democratic and less accountable to these things.
Well, there's a chance to influence politicians. They're going to be debating the provisions on national parks revised in the Natural Environment Bill and consultation. So if you're on the chat line, just get your views in on that. I'm going to go to Christina's question about the future in a minute, but there's a comment and also questions about, Scottish Government just overrides things. It's very centralist, from Fiona Newton. Peachy Earth asks, local communities sort of lost, have they got enough spirit and energy, or are they just demoralised? In other words, it's this debate, how do we turn round from it's all happened to us? You described it beautifully, Ailsa, in your introduction, Frank as well. In a sense, how do we turn it round? And then we can look forward to the Christina's question, well, what's it going to be like in 20 years' time? What's your vision? So, Ailsa.
Okay, thanks, Roger, and thanks for the question. Yeah, it is. It can be very demoralizing. It can be very fatiguing. It can be very time consuming. And that's why it tends to be older, retired people that get involved in these debates, because young people are working and they're bringing up the kids and they've got to think what they're getting on the table for tea. So part of the challenge to all of us is to ensure that we hear those younger voices, and we find mechanisms and forums that appeal to those younger voices. But I think, I've been involved in lots of communities. I think when you actually achieve something, that feeling of success, and you've managed to overachieve the odds, overcome the odds, is really, really impressive, and that really brings more people into what you're doing. So I think it's about sharing good news stories. We need to say, come to Egg, come to Gear, come to Golson, see what can be done when you give people control over their local land and resources, and then take those ideas back. I think we are seeing changes in the way that the enterprise agencies and some big organisations and institutions are working, recognising community empowerment. And obviously we've got the Community Wealth Building Bill coming soon, which again will talk much more about ensuring that some of the wealth stays locally, is not all extracted. So it is positive, but it is hard work. But everything that's worth having is worth fighting for. There are good examples out there, and I talked about the fairy pools in Skye, of what can be done when people come together and work together jointly. So Frank, I know you've got lots of experience in Golson, from the original setup of the Golson Trust and why it was set up, but what you've achieved since then is a fantastic example of overcoming that fatigue, and achieving something fantastic.
Yeah, I'm very positive. I mean, about the future. I think the potential for rural communities is absolutely enormous in these things. And two points I like to pick up on, though. It depends how you measure these things. We often talk about rural communities in a very pejorative manner, as I said before, about being isolated and remote and far away and far flung and behind the scenes and the cities where it's happening and so on. And I think we need to change that dialogue. And part of that dialogue is about dealing with even things like local authorities. I can point to several examples out with this seminar here, where people have been looking for houses in rural areas, and they're not building in rural areas, and they say, well, we're building them in Portree, or we're building them in Stornoway. Well, I don't want to be in Stornoway. They're on the waiting list for a house in Stornoway because that's where houses have been built. But if they had the choice between there and somewhere else, they would choose the other place. So we're not even factoring that into the equation with these things. Now, a thing like Golson Estate Trust, which is very dear to me, intimate to me, just literally outside my window just now. When that was a privately owned estate, it employed nobody, 0 people to manage. Okay, there are now 16 people employed in the community here, and more in some times at times a year, in part-time and job share and so on and so forth, all who live here, who got a chance to contribute in a whole variety of different ways and generate income, generate employment, generate social activities within the community. And that is a really vibrant, rich, and I see the direct, almost like a straight line graph. You can see as people grow in confidence, they think about what else they can do and why they can do it. We're not in the business of asset stripping this community. We're thinking about the environment here in the long term, what we want to do in the long-term process, because we don't want to actually, chop down the trees and sell them off to the highest bidder, because we want our kids to see these things. We want our kids to enjoy, clean beaches and clean water and so on and so forth. And how do we factor that into the occasion, the equation? And if we can tie that in there with things like clean renewable energy, if we can tie it in there with distance working, a link to the online education and UHI and so on was touched upon earlier. That is a game changer. And for a local community like Golson, for example, to actually have the capital of the land and a revenue of any sort coming in to the community, you can then employ people who can do things so we're not totally reliant upon the same old volunteers all the time. So that it's a virtuous circle, but it's an integrated circle rather than just looking at these things as separate baskets and silos.
Okay, so that leads us quite neatly into a question that Christina asked earlier. Imagine the future of rural Scotland, say 20 years or so. What would the ideal balance look like between modern progress, that's an interesting way of putting it, and the preservation of local cultural heritage? Ailsa.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why we're thinking there it's a binary choice between the two, because I suspect if you asked, teenagers that are involved in traditional music, they would not think of themselves being rooted in the past. They would be thinking about their local traditions and how they're using them today and in the future and adding value to them today and in the future. So if I think about sort of modern progress, I'll think about good broadband connections, decent ferry transport, decent housing for young people. So to me, they're all, unless we modernize and progress, we won't, in my opinion, won't be able to maintain and preserve and promote the fantastic heritage of our rural areas in Scotland, because we need people there to continue with them, and we need to be able to bring people in to understand them and to promote them too. So I don't see it as a binary choice between the two. I think both of them are completely intertwined. Frank, what's your thoughts?
I think you have to think about who gains, who wins in these things. That's the bottom line. You follow the money. Who gains from this activity? I mean, remember when you're looking back in the Highland clearances, the architects of the Highland clearances called themselves the improvers. They wanted to improve things, they thought, but it was improving it for them rather than the people they were evicting and so on and so forth. So it's about how you create those things. I think there's a great, I say great store, and my own children look forward to coming back to living in the islands if they can get jobs, if they can get houses, that sort of thing. So that's a key part of it. And in terms of, that COVID taught us a lot. I have the good fortune of being working online in these environments for over 30 years now, 35 years, whatever, right? And before COVID, I lost count of the number of institutions who told us that this is really difficult. This is not possible. Face-to-face is so much better. Which meant that people like me, living on an island offshore, hardly ever could pop into the office in Edinburgh for a 10-minute chat. It was a 2 or 3 day event for me to take part in these things, if I could afford to go. And so the onlineness about this, the ability to communicate at a distance with these things and participate and work at a distance, as I say, which COVID helped to trigger the balance there, showing us that this can be done. And now I feel we're sort of slipping back into the old thing. Oh, it's better to get back to the office and get into the office. When in fact, we've proven categorically that in many jobs, not all, but in many jobs, you can do the job just as well from a distance in your own house, in your own home, in your own local research centre or local college or whatever else it is. So creating those jobs decentralizes this sort of drag towards the urban areas, where it's understandable young people are going because that's where the jobs are, not because they want to be there necessarily, but because they need to work. So we need to rethink these things and push these things out and actually reverse the centrifuge, get things out to the edges and whatnot, and build these things that you can do. The argument used to be, for example, in academia that you had to.
Frank. Yeah.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, I mean, the clear message is it's not one thing or the other. We've got to actually work to a different balance in which communities have greater say. But Des is going to talk about all that, and he's summing up. Anyway, Hughie Stoneman, who works for the Land Commission, says, I come across landowners citing remoteness from nearest communities as a reason for not engaging with or providing benefits to them. How would you respond? Ailsa, I think. I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, no, I've heard that as well, Ruve, and we have to think, why are there no communities there? Because they have been cleared, because the landowners have decided actually they're not social landlords, so they turn everything over to holiday lets and our second homes. So I think the first part is why is there not a community there, and should there be a community there? So I know under the 2019 Planning Act, and there's been conversations since about how we can repopulate some of these cleared areas and bring people back to them. So I think that's the first thing I would say. And there are, of course, communities that are impacted by who owns that land, even if they're not living on that land. It could be the communities next door who are impacted by what's happening on that land. So I don't take that as a valid argument at all, that they're so remote, there's only one or two people locally. I think that's a bit of a cop-out. We shouldn't be accepting it.
So let's move that on. Peachy Earth asks, what role do community land trusts and community development trusts have in going forward then? And they go on to say, does talent drain pose a big risk to their power and fruitful impact?
Shall I just jump in and then?
Yeah, sure. Then Frank can come in after that.
Yeah, Galston as well. I think we need to be establishing more of this local democracy and ownership across more parts of rural Scotland. So the Highlands, it's pretty well embedded now because of the work that Highlands and Islands Enterprise have done over 60 years. But I think there's also a real move in the south of Scotland as well. Now they've seen what's happened in the Highlands and understand what well-resourced communities can do if they're given the resources and access to land and assets. Talent drain, I've not really seen that as a massive issue, because we're saying there's a turnover in community trusts, and a properly run community trust would have a decent succession plan and looking for people to come onto the boards and encouraging young people to come onto boards. So I think in terms of a risk to power, not necessarily. I think community land trusts can sort of wax and wane a bit, particularly if they've got big projects on. You tend to get a lot more interest and excitement at that point, and then you go into a period of sort of stabilization where you're just managing the assets you've got, and you've got different skills and different people involved. So it's not an issue that I found in particular, but it does require people that are involved to continue to engage with the local community and ensure they've got credibility and people see what they're doing, and that's obviously can be quite intensive work in itself. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, and I think that depends on how you're looking at the picture of these things. I think community land trusts have done it. I mean, 3/4 of the Hebrides is basically owned by the community nowadays. And this is extending into other areas in different parts of the country. I'm picking up a point with Fiona Newton there about the building wind farms and pylons everywhere. I mean, Galston Trust, in the state of the north of Lewis here, has 3 turbines, and those 3 turbines put almost £1 million back into the community. So that has changed the whole plan. It changed the ability to do these things. So it's not necessarily the pylons themselves. It's who owns the pylons, who controls them, who makes the money out of these things as it goes through, who benefits from that. Again, following these things through. And I don't think it's a drain on talent, to go back to the question you asked, Roger. I think talent pops up all over the place. And in an eclectic mix like the Highlands and Islands, there are lots of people with multiple hats on who do accountancy in their spare time, but used to be a brain surgeon before they retired and all this sort of stuff, right? So I think that's good. What the problem often is the drain on volunteerism, the drain on the same people all the time to do these things. It's a huge commitment, which people undertake. They do volunteer and they do enjoy it, but it is a strain in itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue. This whole issue of community capacity in the end of the day, and it doesn't matter whether they've been there forever or whether they're recent incomers. Does that mean, though, how do you get younger voices coming in, if you like, to Peachy Earth talks about radical debate and cross-pollination, or on the other hand, other people, Jim Scobie and Trickles are talking about, the role of history in shaping how we feel now. Is there a dichotomy there, or is there things that can be brought together as a positive, new views from younger folk, but also not losing that sense of history?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I go back, I mean, there's the example to follow up from my previous example, Galston Estate engages with people in a chance to people to learn the language, for example. There have been meetings held recently. A new memorial was built to commemorate 100 years of the land raids in this part of the area where people actually, you know, literally fought with the army and the police to reclaim land. And there were a number of public meetings there to talk about the history, to talk about the heritage of this place. And it's astonishing the number of people who've moved into the area who go along to find out about these things. It's not that they don't want to know, they just don't know because they grew up somewhere else. And so it's finding these things out. So I think that having the ability to interpret and see yourselves as you want to be portrayed, having a chance to go and do that gives you a chance to link in with these things and actually to welcome people in the community and welcome these new skills in the context of the place, rather than expecting to find Sainsbury's at the next corner.
Yeah, I mean, I'd completely agree with Frank on that in terms of how you can engage people in the heritage of local areas. I think in terms of bringing young people in, a lot of community trusts focus on projects that are really meaningful to young people. So if we're thinking about housing crisis or the environmental crisis or the lack of, business space for new startups, so we've got Frank said, lots of young people want to come back to rural areas because they recognise the great quality of life they can have, but they need to start a business and there's no space to start a business. So if I think, what we've done on Egg, we've allowed space for a new brewery to set up. We're building houses for young people on Gear. They've just done a fantastic scheme where they've built houses that young people can share as like their starter home. So others have done things like gateway housing to allow young people to come back to the island. So I think if you've got community trusts that are focusing on projects that are of particular interest to young people, they will absolutely get involved, and they're often the most radical voices because it means so much to them. So I think we don't have an issue getting young people involved. As I said previously, they might not want to come to committee meetings on every Tuesday night because they've got something else on, but if it's about building housing or childcare facilities or business space or environmental issues, absolutely no issue at all.
Yeah.
There's one underlying thing that it's not come out in the chat, but it's implied. Is our local decision-making systems helpful or not? There has been a long-standing issue. You shouldn't be building houses in the open countryside, in quotes, a planning spectra, that is, as opposed to putting them in towns, like you said earlier. Do we need to be freeing up, in a sense, the strictures of local planning and therefore the attitudes of the of local council officials and elected members? They are blocking the system now, given that we've got these parallel universes, if you like your organisation, Ailsa, and what you're doing, Frank, in Galston.
Well,
I think the new.
Go on.
No, I'll be really quick, Frank. I was just saying, that the new local place plans are actually really helpful there because they're a new part of the planning system that allow communities to design their own places. So they can say, we know we need housing. If you need housing, they may not, but if we need housing, we know we need it, and this is where we think it should go. And then that actually hugely smooths that process. I'm not saying that the process still isn't complex and overly bureaucratic, but then we are looking at protecting lots of different interests here. But I think, to be fair to Scottish Government, with the local place plan process, and the Chief Planner is encouraging rural housing development in the right places where communities are happy with it. So I think there is a move and there is a debate around that. There's always going to be NIMBYism that particularly perhaps new people, we very often hear, I moved here because I like it just the way it is and I don't want any change, and people wanting to pull the drawbridge up behind them. And those are the voices that we really have to quell and say this community will not survive if we all take that approach. Frank.
There's a fundamentally different perspective when you think, do we want to build 500 new houses on the edge of a small village, or if a community land trust has it and says, we'll put 5 here and 10 there and 4 there and 2. And by the way, we own the land, so we can make that land available to you at a knockdown price, because if you build in social housing, if you build in services, etc. with that, you have the ball at your control, rather than just responding to a developer who, because of the profit margins and so on, wants to put 500 houses in the one place. And that's been done in places like North Harris, for example, and different areas, whatnot, where they've actually been able to rebuild in some areas. In some cases, some of these areas that were inhabited in the past and have now been, have depopulated through various things over the generations. So I think it's a different end of the telescope you're looking down.
Final point then, before I ask Des to sum up. Are we talking all the time about what urban people think are the remoter rural areas? I mean, what's the real... I'd be interested in your view, Ailsa, given the work of your organisation, or those that are still rural. In other words, they're not urban or semi-urban. Have we got the policies right to differentiate between these different situations, between Unst on the one hand and somewhere quite close to Dumfries on the other, or something?
Yeah, given the time, can I answer that really quickly, Roger, and just say
sure.
no?
That's it. Yeah.
No, we haven't.
No. Yeah.
And I think we have policies, but we don't follow through with the implementations. There are some good decisions taken, and they're not implemented.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much for all of those questions in the chat. I hope you found that valuable. Some really interesting things that are going on. So over to Des to tell us how he summarises this.
Wow,
Good luck.
pressure. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Ailsa and Frank, for a fantastic conversation. We've certainly drilled deep into the foundations on which are built our senses of belonging, specialness, and distinctiveness that help define rural Scotland. Let me touch on 5 points, if I may, very briefly. First, thinking of the islands, north and west, and the rural mainland, the identity stamp is clear through history, language, produce, buildings, nature and landscape, and we've heard many examples of these and many more. But is this identity fading or homogenizing, as we refer to it in ecological terms? I think we've heard that it is, and we need to act on this loss of identity. Second, and related to this, Frank intriguingly discussed the commercialization of regional distinctiveness. Now, this is a two-edged sword, as tourism and related enterprises may be the only source of significant income, yet in excessive amounts can ruin the very ingredients of what is so special and important. Clearly, we have to get the balance right in that regard. And Roger asked, who decides on what is best? Well, as we have heard, that is where the community discussion and decision-making is so crucial in finding the best balance. And where we've got good community governance, we can make real progress. And third, and again related to this theme of change, Ailsa drew on her terrific experience of rural community leadership and discussed resilience, sustainability, and urgency of action. The change in land ownership pattern, rural housing crisis, health and social care challenges, and shortage of well-paid jobs are in part a consequence of the allure of regional identity for outsiders who may buy up what were family homes as holiday lets or large tracts of land for so-called green investments. Fundamentally, this needs to be critically looked at, for we need to sustain vibrant rural communities. And Fiona touched on this very well in the chat, touching on this perception that government rides roughshod, in her words, over community means to meet net zero. Clearly, that perception is real. And we need to tackle this head on. Thinking about commercial forestry and wind farm developments, we need to make sure development bodies work with and not against communities who, after all, have to live with the consequences. And in the case of some forestry schemes, get very few benefits. Fourth, the funding model is troubling. Again, as both Frank and Ailsa touched on, there is this terminological tautology of talking down subsidies for rural areas, but proclaiming investments or incentives for urban enterprises. Well, it's really the same pot of public money, and we need to get better at talking up investment in communities, especially young people and landscapes that need to enrich the different parts of rural Scotland. And I have to say, Frank gave a very good example of the Golson estate community benefiting from just 3 wind turbines. That's a significant signpost for future development. And that takes me to my final take on this excellent discussion. And that concerns really the history and culture shaping the very heritage of what tugs at the heartstrings of resident and visiting people alike. Heritage in the form of traditions, languages, buildings and imprints of past human presence is irreplaceable. And it's the very essence of what makes rural Scotland so special. So we must do all we can to invest in that special heritage, our heritage, or it will perish and not only be lost, but worse, perhaps, forgotten about. So that's my take. Thank you for everyone for joining this final virtual conversation. I hope this is not the end, but the beginning of a vital discussion, hopefully leading to a genuinely more sustainable and enriching future for rural Scotland. Now back to you, Roger. Thank you.
Excellent, Des. Thank you very much indeed. Just a perfect summary. But our 2 speakers have got the last word on this. Ailsa, what's your takeaway point, please?
Yeah, thanks, Roger, and thanks for that summary, Des. I think I'm a perennial optimist, and I think it's really easy to identify all that is wrong and all that needs changing. But I think across Scotland, in lots of rural areas, there are lots of fantastic examples of what is right and what is going well, and what we need to learn from and what we need to share, how we need to influence the policymakers and the investors that actually things can be done differently. They can still make money, but actually some of those profits can be shared more equitably, that actually communities can own more, they can do more, we can make better decisions at a local level. So I think what we need to do is build on the good examples and share the good examples and continue to sort of proselytize for those good examples, and that behoves all of us to do that, because as I say, it's very, very easy to talk about everything that's wrong, but actually Scotland, compared to lots and lots of countries, we're actually doing a huge amount right.
Excellent, thank you. And Frank?
Yep, I'll give you 1 sentence. I think cultural vibrancy and engagement is at the root of community confidence and enterprise. So don't underestimate the importance of the local.
A perfect ending. So if you want to listen to that again, you can find it on our RSE YouTube channel, and you can also listen to the previous 4 as well to get some idea of this debate. Although it's been sliced into 5 different issues, we've strayed across the boundaries all of the time, because that's what life is like on this sort of issue. Nothing is in a silo, except if it's in St Andrew's House or the Scottish Parliament, and then sadly it is. And so this debate is really vitally important, not just for rural communities, it's vital for all of us in Scotland, wherever we live and whatever we do, and however long people like Ailsa and I have lived here and will continue to do so. So I hope you've enjoyed today. It's been a fascinating discussion. This is the end of this series, but it's not the end of what we want to do in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Our whole objective in having these types of interactions is to engage with civic society, with all of you and all others who have responded. We'll do it online because it is a very successful medium. We can get really good interaction. We've got lots of opportunities on all of these big issues, whether they're rural or urban, whether they're about community or nature, because they're all interconnected in the end of the day. And what we want to see is a more informed public debate in Scotland, so that when the parliamentarians begin to look at these bills, like the Natural Environment Bill, the latest Land Reform Bill, they are informed with what we, the people of Scotland, are thinking about and what our concerns are, so that they're really addressing them. And that's the essence of our society in the future. And all the Royal Society of Edinburgh seeks to do is to provide a platform and to facilitate that debate so that we have more informed decisions for the future for our children and our grandchildren. So thank you all very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks obviously to Frank and Ailsa for their wonderful interactions and their great experience on these issues, and Des for